Cold cases provide an almost entertaining source of suspense. It's both sad and interesting to imagine cases from several decades ago still sit dormant and collect dust as justice seems to pass by. Every year, science and technology advances greatly though, and some cold cases finally have the necessary tools to be solved. Cold cases are often unsolved due to a lack of evidence, so it's no surprise that the availability of improved evidence collecting methods are often what help investigators put these old cases to rest. Number 5. In April of 2019, a 41-year-old unsolved case was finally put to rest when new DNA evidence was found. The first victim of this case was Jane Morton Antoinette. On the night of November 10, 1977, she called a close friend that lived a few streets away. The two women made plans to spend time together that evening, and Jane told her that she was going to get ready and head over. The unidentified friend assumed that it would take Jane about 30 to 45 minutes to arrive. The night carried on, but Jane still hadn't showed up or called to cancel. Finally, she drove to Jane's house to find that no one was home. It was discovered that Jane's apartment appeared to have been empty all night, meaning that Jane never made it back home. She also missed work, which was very out of character for her. About a week later, on November 18, 1977, Jane's car was found. The car was parked alongside a dirt road in California, and upon approaching the vehicle, officers spotted a person in the back seat. They quickly broke into the car and realized that they had just found Jane. She was lying in the fetal position across her back seat, and a disturbing mess had been left behind, with an inspection of her body showing that her throat had been cut and she was sexually assaulted. A witness came forward and claimed that they'd seen Jane pick up a mysterious man the night that she went missing. Officers were unable to confirm that or find DNA evidence of a male presence. The second victim was a 28-year-old Patricia Dwyer. The details of Patricia's case were more limited. She lived alone with her beloved pet, a husky, and on January 11, 1977, Pat's family became concerned when they couldn't reach her over the phone. Pat also frequently visited her relatives but hadn't done so in quite a while. Her sister went to her home and saw Pat's car still in the driveway. She knocked for several minutes and tried to get in, but finally called police who busted into the house and found Pat. She'd been pierced in the chest with a kitchen knife, with blood being found all over the house and all over her dog. It was clear that the dog had been trying to get a response from Pat. The front door had been locked and there were no signs of struggle or a break-in, but relatives insist Pat would never have let a stranger into her home. Investigators linked the cases of Pat and Jane because the two women lived relatively close and the crimes occurred only 2 months apart. Additionally, the women were attacked in a similar manner. Both victims' arms were found behind their backs and other bindings were found at both crime scenes. In-depth investigations were carried out for both cases, but a lack of evidence prevented things from moving forward. A men's razor was found in the bathroom medicine cabinet of Pat's home, but DNA test proved that it matched the DNA found on Jane's body, but technology hadn't advanced enough at the time to uncover who the DNA belonged to. Police were unable to find any leads, and so eventually the cases went cold. The families of both women suffered for decades, living without answers and knowing the criminal was still out there somewhere. A spark of hope began to glimmer in 2019 though, when new evidence was found and the cases were pulled out of storage. Arthur Martinez was a sketchy character with a blemished criminal past. In 1994, Martinez was found guilty of several robberies and cases of forced violations of women. Martinez was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison, and while serving his time in Washington state, Martinez somehow escaped. He fled to Fresno, California and lived under an alias until 2014. He was diagnosed with cancer and knew that in prison he would receive free medical attention, so he turned himself in. Within 2 months of serving his prison sentence, he passed away. Investigators were not done though, and they retested the men's razor using the technology now available. When comparing the sample to Martinez, it was a confirmed match. While prosecutors can't charge Martinez now, considering he's gone, both families were finally relieved to have answers. Number 4. In March of 1974, Janet Ann Taylor was your typical 21-year-old college girl. She worked at a successful information center and attended school in Canada. Many of Janet's friends studied at Stanford University in Palo Alto. The distance between the two campuses was short, so Janet would often meet up with these friends. Much to the disagreement of her friends and father, though, she mostly hitchhiked on her route. On March 24, 1974, Janet spent time with a group of friends until about 7 p.m. when she left to head home. A witness reported seeing Janet at about 7:30 that evening. The witness stated that she watched Janet for a few seconds while passing through traffic, as he claimed that she was walking along the side of a busy road and stopped occasionally to stick her hand out in an attempt to catch a ride. He did not describe her as looking upset, frazzled, or scared. She apparently strolled along with a smile as if she wasn't doing anything dangerous at all. This witness was the last person to see her alive, and when she didn't return home that night, her father called some friends. They confirmed that Janet had been with them before leaving on foot at around 7 p.m. Janet didn't mention to her friends that she would be making any stops or going anywhere else. Her father immediately called the cops because he knew something horrible had to have happened. Officers arrived and asked the man some questions about his daughter, but informed him that she'd been gone long enough for a missing persons case to open. The police left and the father tried to sleep, hoping that Janet may have still been out somewhere with other friends. The next morning, a delivery driver was traveling down Sand Hill Road, an area that didn't see much traffic and sat just outside of a wooded area. And a few feet off the roadside into the woods, a small body of water under a bridge was seen. In that area, the delivery driver noticed someone lying near the water. He instinctively knew exactly what he had just seen and got out of his car and approached. The man ran to a payphone to contact police, who arrived a few minutes later and recognized the woman as Janet. She'd been attacked with some sort of rope or clothing, which had been wrapped around her neck, constricting her airway. Her clothes were perfectly neat and intact, and an autopsy showed no signs of assault, though her underwear had been found stuffed into her mouth, so police still assumed that the crime was related to non-consensual intercourse. No DNA could be found at the scene or on Janet, and the case began to fade out almost as quickly as it started, as police couldn't provide any evidence or a suspect to keep the case open. This was not a unique case, though. Between 1972 and 1976, 4 other women were found in almost identical surroundings. They'd all been walking alone when they were attacked, and in these 4 cases, 5 including Janet, many of the details were so similar that investigators began linking the cases together to consider that it may have been the work of a serial killer. In late 2018, John Gertrude was arrested for the murder of one of the other victims in this series. While in custody, investigators sampled his DNA for the other cases and found it was a match. In 2019, Gertrude had already been convicted of all the other crimes, and investigators worked Janet's case and found that his DNA also matched the samples found on Janet. He was charged and convicted for 3 of the cases, but police believe he was linked to many more. If it wasn't for the advances in technology over the decades, Janet's case may always have remained a mystery. Number 3. In 1982, the body of a woman was found near Lake Tahoe in Nevada. No identification was found on her despite a community outreach, and no one came forward as a friend or relative of this woman. Since her name remained unknown, she was given the nickname Sheep's Flat Jane Doe, a result of the fact that she was found in an area known as Sheep's Flat, just outside of a popular hiking trail. The victim's clothes suggest that she was dressed for a day at the lake, and they were still intact. Investigators found 2 sets of footprints trailing from a parking area where Jane Doe was found. However, there was only 1 set of prints returning. The prints offered evidence about the size of the other person's shoes, but the dirt wasn't wet enough to expose any details of the person's sole. This put a stump on the evidence, and at first Jane Doe was thought to have been of European nationality because of her inoculation scars on her arm and her dental work. Tests performed on her clothes found that her shirt came from a chain in the West Coast. The shirt wasn't sold anywhere else, so officers assumed that it meant Jane Doe had either lived in or visited a western state before coming to Nevada. The most important and obvious piece of evidence was a clear wound that Jane Doe had suffered. She'd been shot, and due to a lack of resources at the time, the police department was unable to trace back the bullet. All of these dead ends stopped the investigation very quickly, and the case went cold. Jane Doe was put to rest at Our Lady Sorrows of North Virginia Street in Nevada. But later in 2010, a new dental exam disproved the theory that Jane Doe was European. In July of 2008, the case gained attention where the DNA Doe Project was founded. The project uses resources, donations, and volunteers to reopen cold cases. DNA Doe was able to identify Sheep's flat Jane Doe in early 2019 as Mary Edith Silvani. She was the daughter of an immigrant that grew up in Michigan, and her killer was identified as Texas resident James Richard Curry. Unfortunately though, James had passed away before this information was revealed, so no charges would be handed out. It's unclear why Mary's family never came forward, but wherever they are, there's no doubt they're happy to finally have answers. Number 2. Pamela Milad was last seen on the night of September 15, 1972. She just left a sorority event at Indiana State University. When she left the party, she'd had a few drinks, but was not described as intoxicated. She never returned home that night or much of the next day, which worried her family. They called the police and a very short search was conducted, and later that night, on the same day that it began, Pamela was found in the truck of her own car, which had been left on the roadside. She'd been bound and gagged, and officers suspected a man that was arrested a few weeks earlier for assault. However, a lack of evidence and witnesses prevented them from filing any charges. A few months went by, but no new information was revealed and the case was thrown aside and labeled cold. Though the police chief of the area reopened the case in 2008, and using DNA evidence was able to rule out the previous suspect. In 2018, Police Chief Keene joined forces with Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that works with law enforcement using DNA, ancestry databases, and traditional genealogical work to try and solve Millam's murder. Using the results provided by them in 2019, he linked Jeffrey Lynn Hand to the case. Hand had been killed in a police shootout in 1978, but Keene located his widow and children to sample their DNA. He then compared that sample to the DNA found on Pamela's crime scene and found that it was a match. Again, in this case, no charges were filed because the main suspect was deceased. However, courts recognized the DNA evidence as enough to label Hand as the killer and finally close Pamela's case. Her family had been left with no answers for nearly 46 years, but were delighted to finally know the truth. They also mentioned that knowing that he wasn't on the streets any longer much after Pamela's death was a relief. Number 1. 20-year-old Susan Galvin was a records clerk working for the city when she lost her life. On July 9, 1967, Susan failed to show up for her night shift and her employers became worried. It was very unlike Susan to miss work, especially without calling. Her boss knew that she spent most of her time alone and became fearful that Susan was in danger. He called her family to see if they'd heard from her, and when they said no, both sides realized these weren't just worried thoughts. They called police who asked some questions and began a search. The hunt for Susan was abruptly stopped though when someone found her body. Susan had been stuffed into a parking garage elevator at the Seattle Center. It took a while for her body to be found because at the time, the Seattle Center parking garage was not experiencing much traffic. Apparently, a few people did walk right past the elevator on their way to use the stairs though, which is an eerie thought. Susan had been assaulted and strangled. No evidence was found at the scene and no witnesses came forward, and no suspects were considered. The case was empty, and considering the limited technology at the time, most assumed that it would never be solved. The case fell cold and laid to the side, out of the minds of investigators for several decades. But in 2019, the case was 52 years old and considered one of the oldest cold cases in history. Seattle police detective Rolf Morton said that no one had forgotten about Susan or her case. Although the file still sat for over 5 decades, Morton explained that many officers and investigators at the precinct knew about Susan and would often make efforts to reopen the case. While her case wasn't reopened, a few years ago the DNA found at the scene was submitted to a database for genealogy. In 2019, Seattle police were notified that a match had been found. The match was for a man named Frank Wipish. Considering the DNA was found, police consider Wipish to be Susan's killer. Unfortunately though, he died in 1987, and most of the family that knew Susan had passed away long ago as well. Susan's brothers, Chris and Larry Galvin though, are still alive to honor her memory. When speaking with officers about her sister's life and death, both men tried to fight back tears. Chris and Larry also expressed how happy they were that the truth was finally revealed. The loss had tormented their family for decades, and they feared that it would never be solved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep updated with our videos.